Hello, welcome to this very special edition of Talk It Over. We're coming to you from the Senate recording studio, and my guest is Senator Dennis DeConcini, who's been a member of the Senate for 8 years and participates in the Appropriations Committee, the Judiciary, the Veterans, so on and so forth. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ellen. It's nice to be back on the show. It's been a while. We just seem to both have such busy schedules, but it's sure good to be talking to someone from Tucson.
If you come through the subway to this recording studio, you see all these senators hurrying and scurrying because the bells are ringing and it's about time to vote on the bills.
Well, you were here in a real busy day today because we've been voting on the budget for the last 2 weeks, trying to adopt a budget that we have set for ourselves by law that we must adopt. And it's no easy task getting a budget, particularly in these days of the deficits. And the President has offered a budget, and the majority here, the Republicans, are not satisfied with it because it's too big a deficit. And the House has passed one with a less deficit, and we Democrats are squabbling over which deficit we want to get across. So we've really been going at it now for 2 weeks, and today we had a number of votes, and probably we'll finish it up next week.
What we all read and hear is that no matter how much a pet project is cut in the budget, that until we, the citizens, tackle the entitlement problems, that we're going to get nowhere.
That's probably a good assessment. The entitlements take over 50% of our budget today, more than anything else if you count Social Security and what have you. It's somewhat unfair to entitlement receivers, pension holders and other retirees, to count them as part of the consolidated budget, but that's the way the law is, because a lot of these programs, you take the federal retirees, federal workers who are retired, and you take Social Security people, they have paid into that system now. Some haven't paid all that they get out of it, but a lot of them have. So they're getting back some of the money that they put in the employer. But the fact of the matter, we have a consolidated budget, so every outlay goes against that deficit, and that means every dollar spent in Social Security or for defense or anything else goes towards that deficit. And without doing something about the entitlements, as well as doing something about our defense expenditures that have just mushroomed, it is going to be almost impossible to bring this into balance. At the same time, the fundamental problem that we are facing, Ellen, that is probably not realized, and a lot of us, I guess, like to ignore it, because we cut taxes in this country 25% since Ronald Reagan came in, and I'm one of those senators who voted for it at the beginning, but since I've been trying my best to repeal part of it, it turned out not to bring us the prosperity that the President, I'm sure, truly believed that it would. And we have seen that it has brought us the biggest deficits and the worst recession. Though we are in a recovery now, we are suffering this great deficit that is accumulating and likely to be another $1 trillion in about 6 years since 1980. So we have got to look at all three of these. What can we do defense-wise to maintain a strong military security and yet not increase it 13 or 14% as the President has asked us to? What can we do about cuts across the board for everybody else, including Congress expenditures and the President's expenditures and non-entitlement programs, so everybody would take some relief or some sacrifice? And then what can we honestly ask entitlement holders to give? They've already given a lot because they've had their COLAs frozen, and what else can they be asked to give? I think you're right that you have to look at the entitlement programs. It's not popular, politically it gets you in trouble, but you got to do it.
I think that the average citizen is sitting in their home saying, why can't you guys in Congress get your act together? If I run my house the way you run, you meaning all of our elected legislators, run this country, I would be bankrupt. They would take back everything that I owned. And why can't you operate under the same rules? If it's necessary to assess every American a penalty, taxes, less entitlement, why can't you do it, and let's get on with it?
Well, I'll tell you, and it's a good question. I'll tell you why we can't do it. We are probably the only entity that I know that can spend deficit dollars without having an overdraft on your account. If you do that in your business or at your household, or I do that in mine, sometime the bank finally says, hey, we're not going to pay those drafts. Congress and the President can continue to print that money and go into debt. And that's what has happened here. Because what the system has generated into is simply this. It's easy for people like myself in Congress, all of us, I don't care how conservative or liberal or moderate you may be, to support good programs that make a lot of sense for your state, for your country, for your national defense, for your retirees, for your health of children and everything else, and really not have to pay for it by raising taxes. Because if you don't want to raise taxes, and what we did is we cut taxes way too much. What happens? You're in debt. You're in debt. And what happens when you go into debt? Well, first of all, nothing happens right now. We're not suffering a drastic economic downturn. We're going to if we don't do something. Your question is, why don't we get our act together? Well, I'll tell you, we don't get our act together for some reasons. One, in my judgment, is you need a strong leader in the White House who has a program. This president had a program. It didn't happen to work, in my opinion. And then you need a stronger leader, if the program doesn't work, to reverse it and come back. And then you need some strong leaders in Congress to come forward with some ideas and try to bring together a majority of people that would reduce that deficit. That just flat hasn't happened up here to any significance where we can get that deficit down.
Has anybody ever done any statistical work on, if you asked every taxpayer to do their part, how many years of tightening the belt we would have to go through?
Well, yeah, sure. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. One way that you could balance this budget, they say in 4 years, is to pass a flat tax, doing away with all exemptions except for the very poorest family, say $10,000, first $10,000 no one would pay tax on, and have a flat rate across the board with no exemptions. A lot of people think that sounds good. I'm for it. I've got a bill for it, but a lot of special interests don't want it. If you did that, based on the gross national product of today, and saying that it didn't grow the next 4.5 years, you'd have a balanced budget based on that income at 19%. Now, you might pay more and you might not like it. I would pay more and I might not like it, but that's one approach. Another approach is to start a program of every time you spend something, you got to come up with the money, buy a new tax or cut someplace. And that's another approach. And the best approach is to have a constitutional amendment that would no longer let the President of the United States or Congress spend deficit dollars unless they had a 3/4 or 2/3 vote, which is very difficult to get out of both houses. Those are some alternatives, and as we march down this trail of red ink, and this locomotive full of red ink keeps coming at us, we're going to see some changes here, because I don't know how long we can live when we're close to going towards the $2 trillion in just 6 years.
And it's not only how we can live, but what about our children?
Well, you know, that's what we're doing. We are mortgaging the future. And President Reagan, there probably hasn't been any president that is stronger for a balanced budget, and promised it all his career, and got into Washington and got swallowed up, just like Jimmy Carter did. He promised a balanced budget in 4 years. He left us with $60 billion. We all thought that's terrible. Well, this president has got swallowed up too by the special interest, by the enticement of cutting people's taxes, and we have cut domestic spending at the suggestion of President Reagan by over $90 billion over the last 3 years. That's a healthy reduction. But we cut income to the government by $700 billion over the last 4 years, and we raised national defense by $200 billion. What does it give us? It gives us these deficits, and the problem is your children and mine and our grandchildren are going to pay for it sometime. And when that time comes, our standard of living is going to be less, or their standard of living is going to be less, because you can't go forever on the free lunch.
We'll come back in a moment and we'll talk about what's going on in current politics, i.e. Walter Mondale. My guest is Senator Dennis DeConcini, who has served in the Senate of the United States for 8 years. Let's talk about current politics. Now, you were an early supporter of Walter Mondale. How do you think he's doing? And do you have any inside information as to who's going to be the vice presidential candidate if Walter Mondale succeeds?
Well, I think Mondale is doing reasonably well. Naturally, being a very early supporter, I had hoped that last Tuesday he would have carried both Indiana and Ohio, and those were squeakers. He still did well in the delegate count, just like he did in Arizona. He didn't carry the state, but we got 15 delegates to Hart 17, so he did well in those states delegate-wise, but he didn't get the popular vote. He did get the popular vote in Maryland and in North Carolina. So, you know, it's somewhat of a wash. I think he's going to get the nomination. I feel very comfortable that he will. He's within a few hundred delegates now getting it, and we still have California and a number of other states. Once he gets it, it's going to be a healing process. A lot's going to depend on whether or not Senator Hart and Reverend Jackson are willing to beat Ronald Reagan enough to really come on board and help. Now, your question as to a vice president. I don't know what the Vice President Mondale will do. I've not talked to him directly. I enjoy a friendship with him, and he has asked me opinion on a number of times. And if he should suggest or ask me an opinion, I would really seriously urge him to consider a woman. I think the time is ripe for a woman, and there are some women who are qualified not because they're women, but because they're good public servants. They've got the skills and ability just like any man who's been in government for some time. And so, to me, that's the advice I would give him. And I think it's the time.
Which women would you throw in on the
list?
Well,
just to speculate, Ellen, Shirley Huffstedler, who was the first Secretary of the Department of Education, a Ninth Circuit appellate judge, an outstanding lawyer, a woman who is in the forefront of women's movement without being way out, if you want to call it that.
What state is she from?
California. Outstanding lady. Know her well, and she's very, very competent. You have people like Pat Schroeder, who Congresswoman from Colorado. You have Geraldine Ferrara, Congresswoman from New York. You have the new governor from Kentucky, and there are some outstanding people. Another hypothetical that I see as a possibility is someone like Lee Iacocca, who has not yet declared for Walter Mondale, but they're friends. And that would bring, of course, a real business image to Mondale, and
balance his pro-labor image.
That's right. Contrary to his public image of being in labor's pocket and what have you, and he's not. I know him well enough. He has had their support, and that's a good possibility.
What about the rumors that have been circulating around Arizona that if Walter Mondale were elected, that Dennis DeConcini might be the Attorney General?
Well, of course, that's again speculative. I think that rumor starts from the fact that I've been in law enforcement, as you and I both worked in the county attorney office. Kind of seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
Certainly does.
Working in the county attorney's office and being involved in law enforcement, that's a natural thing to come to the conclusion that I'd be interested in. And indeed, that area of law enforcement has always interested me. But there's been no discussion between me and the vice president, and rightfully so. He's got to get the nomination. He's got to bring the party together. He's got to sell himself to this country as a middle-of-the-road candidate who is not going to promise a balanced budget like President Reagan has and give us the worst deficit, is going to promise a program that's going to reduce the deficit and bring us some fiscal sanity here. And, you know, assuming that happens and assuming that he can get elected, then I think there's a reasonable chance that a number of qualified people, and I don't rule myself out, would certainly be under consideration for some of those positions. But there's a lot of good law enforcement people, a lot of good lawyers, and a lot of good friends of Walter Mondale, just like there are of President Reagan.
We'll be back in a moment, and I want to ask Dennis about the copper situation, and is there any new legislation that can help our beleaguered copper workers? Senator Dennis DeConcini is our guest on this special edition of Talk It Over, coming to you from the Senate broadcast studios. The poor copper workers, they've been out of work for so long, and we hear about loans to countries that produce copper in competition with us. We hear about reduced demand for copper. What about the copper use for storing radioactive material, and what else is going on?
Well, the copper industry is just about flat on its back. As you mentioned, the copper workers, 13 of the some 25 or 6 mines in Arizona are shut down, may never open again. The industry has lost literally billions of dollars. Copper workers are out of work, so we got a problem. Your question about the canisters, potential use of that's a good long-term use. It's going to be 1990 or greater, assuming that it's justifiable. I think it is. There's some things we got to do. And to just tick off a few of them, one is put an environmental tax on imported copper. Our copper companies spend about 15 to 16 cents a pound cleaning the air up. Copper from Chile, Zaire, or Mexico comes into this country without that tax being paid on it. We ought to collect it on tax.
Will there be any group that will oppose your efforts to get that tax?
Yeah, unfortunately, even some of the American copper companies who mine copper overseas don't want to pay that on imported copper.
So they're voting against themselves?
Sometimes. So that's a problem. Plus the feeling of this administration, Mr. Brock and President Reagan, is no tariffs, no protectionism, all free trade, and that's a good idea if it's fair trade. Another possibility that I think we should do is no longer vote to fund international banks like the World Bank that loan money to countries that produce copper at a subsidized rate. And that's what happens in Mexico, in Chile, and many other countries. They are government owned or government subsidized, and they keep producing the copper regardless of what the price is. That keeps their people to work.
Why did we get into this in the first place? No sane person would loan money to somebody who's in competition.
Well, I tell you, it's an international problem within our State Department, and it seems to make no difference whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. That just keeps permeating our judgment. We've got to participate. We've got to continue to put in 34% of the money in the World Bank that is then loaned to Chile to build copper mines, or to Brazil to build steel mills that are going to compete with our own.
And we can have no restrictions on our money going in?
I voted against it in the Congress, and we almost defeated our replenishment in the World Bank this year. Only by about 4 votes, I believe, did it pass. So we're getting close to it. Hopefully the message will be there to the World Bank Board of Directors that maybe they ought not to do that to countries that are contributors, at least those that are contributors. There's a lot of things they can loan their money for. They can build chemical, they can help farming, they can build water projects, they can build roads, and things that will help those countries without being in competition with American workers. I'm fed up with it.
We'll be right back. Senator Dennis DeConcini is our guest for this edition of Talk It Over. Dennis has participated, a member of the Appropriations Committee, the Judiciary, the Veterans Committee. I'd like to spend this segment talking a little bit about the future of Dennis DeConcini, and I would like to go in 2 directions. When you ran for office 8 years ago, you declared you would be a 2-term senator. You declared that very emphatically, and now the end of the 2nd term is approaching. And what is going through Dennis DeConcini's mind?
Well, Ellen, that question is raised all the time, and I'm very flattered. People keep coming to me and say you should run and change your mind. I haven't changed my mind. I don't suppose that means that I couldn't change my mind. I believe very strongly in limiting the amount of years that people serve, whether it's 2 terms or 3 terms or whatever it is, and I've introduced constitutional amendments to do that. My own feeling is that unless something changed in my life that made me think about it again, that's what I intend to do. I have some other things in my life I want to do. People say that can't be true. Nobody wants to give up being a senator. Well, being a senator is a great privilege, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to serve Arizona, but believe it or not, like Howard Baker, our majority leader, says, there is life after the Senate, as there was life before the Senate. My quandary about changing my mind, not only the political problems that it might pose, having indicated very forcefully that I believe in limitation to term, is whether or not I feel I could do anything for Arizona if I decided I wanted to run again. And that is something that you got to really be honest with yourself. We like to think of ourselves as the most important people in the world back here, doing all these wonderful things. Quite frankly, it's very discouraging, the deficits that we have accumulated in this country just the 8 years that I've been here. And though I'm not the president and I don't write the budget, and I'm for a constitutional amendment and have voted many times to reduce that deficit, it is really a troublesome situation of what has happened to this country. And I have to address that realistically, of how do you cope with that if indeed I wanted to serve longer in this body.
I heard your father, Judge DeConcini, give a speech, and in which he said that he was upset about something, and he mentioned it to you and said, why don't you do something about it? And your reply was, I'm only one of how many senators, and there's hardly anything I can do about it without the majority. It indicated a tremendous level of frustration.
There is a lot of frustration, Ellen, and I feel it out in this country too. This country needs a strong leader. And unfortunately, the last two presidents have been extremely political and quite weak in my judgment. A lot of our past presidents have, and maybe it's asking too much for a strong leader to go through what they have to go through to get the nomination and be president. We need someone who probably is willing to serve one term as president and say, this is my program, I'm going to take it to the people. Ronald Reagan started out that way, and quite frankly, I thought he maybe was going to be that president. But he wasn't. He has brought us the biggest deficits ever and nowhere near a balanced budget. And he's got swallowed up, as we talked before. So until that leader comes forward, and I'm not kidding myself that I'm it, I'd like to be part of a team that would take this head on and really do something about the deficit. But until that comes, there's going to be this tremendous frustration. And what worries me, probably more than anything else, is the jeopardy we're placing our country in by these economic conditions that we're going to go through with this continued deficit, and not facing the problem. Martin Feldstein resigned last week. He's a noted economist, a strong conservative, and a Republican all his life. Here he is telling President Reagan that deficits are bad for us and that you need to control that money supply. And if you don't do it, interest rates are going to go up. And here you have President Reagan being advised by Secretary Reagan saying, don't worry about the deficits. Don't worry, everything's going to go along rosy. It's not happening.
I have one more quick question.
Yep.
Some people have said that being in early on Walter Mondale's campaign and being a big part of it is a very good thing for Dennis DeConcini to do for 4 years from now. And do you have aspirations to vice presidency or the presidency?
Oh, no.
Now that's a quick question,
yeah, that's a
Dennis.
quick question. Let me just say, who knows what 4 years will hold for me, Ellen. You know, maybe I'll change my mind. If I do, I'll address that and run again. Maybe I'll come back to Arizona where you live and where my heart still is, and Susan and I like it back there, so that won't be a bad alternative either. As far as serving in some position in the government of Walter Mondale or anyone else, only time will tell. It's a matter of timing, being at the right place in the right time. I happen to be there in 1976, and maybe in '88 I'll be there too, who knows.
Thank you for taking time out of your very busy day. Thank you for joining us on Talk It Over.